Welcome to Grappling with Gray, a forum for promoting an ethical mindset and ethical decision-making to help us more clearly see both sides of complex issues and better navigate the moral challenges of everyday life. I am Rabbi Yonason Goldson, and I would like to welcome my guest today. With me is J.C. Glick, a retired Army Ranger Lieutenant Colonel. He is a leadership, strategy, and culture advisor, as well as an author and TEDx speaker. Sarah Calmetta, also known as Sarah the Pivoter, is a speaker, author, and relentless truth seeker. That's why she's here. She is founder of Pivot Point International, a high-performance consulting company. And Scott Mason, also known as the Myth Slayer, is a speaker, podcast host, and coach working with executives and entrepreneurs to magnetize and monetize professional freedom by dislodging toxic myths to ignite the charisma within. Thank you all for being with me, especially since this is episode number 64, and we are doing something that we have never done before, which is reconvening a past panel because it was so much fun the last time. So we'll see what happens. Here is our topic for today. Speaking of dispelling toxic myths, 2024 is shaping up to be the third presidential election in a row where the majority of Americans oppose both candidates. A recent Economist YouGov poll found 56% of voters don't want former President Donald Trump to run for re-election, and 59% don't want Joe Biden to either. Yet odds are that's exactly what we're going to get. Granted that there are no perfect candidates, and realistically, we can't expect to agree with any candidate on everything. But if I conclude that one candidate is unfit to serve, whether because of character or competence or both, is it ethical for me to vote for that candidate anyway, solely because the opposing candidate is even worse? One common refrain is that voting for a third-party candidate is either a wasted vote or a vote for the opposition. But never in history has any vote with an electorate of more than 25,000 people been decided by one single vote, which means that my vote by itself will not make a difference in the outcome. If so, why should I not vote my conscience? In his book, Integrity, Yale law professor Stephen O. Carter writes, "I look forward to the day when we as voters will say, I agree with so-and-so on most of the issues, but I could never vote for someone who would say or do that, say this or do that in order to win. Without discussing the merits or flaws of any specific candidate, why do so few Americans seem to accept Professor Carter's ideal?" The floor is open.
Wow. If you're going to reconvene a panel, I guess it's good that we're seasoned in this together, because that's a banger.
Absolutely.
I'll just start with something here, which is that although ideally we would not be in a position where we feel as a collective that we have no choice but to support the least bad candidate, I don't feel a particularly troubling ethical feel around voting for someone merely because they're not as awful as the next one, if what the next one is representing is truly awful, is truly presenting some sort of existential or deep-seated threat to the safety or the overall welfare of the political system itself or the belief systems that we as a culture operate within. So I do think that the weight of how candidates are assessed in that situation by individuals and us as a collective allow some or almost force some latitude with regards to where that existential line is crossed. But if that existential line is crossed I feel like it's almost an ethical imperative to just support the person who's less awful. That being said, with regards to writing in a third party candidate and my vote doesn't count because one vote is never decided an election or not, if every single person took that attitude, then we would really be up blankety blanks creek. We need to understand, and I think that it's important to really take in that in a democratic society or in even a republic system like that we have right now, votes operate to reflect a collective good. If we're not even willing to participate in the collective decision making, then we're abdicating our responsibility as a citizen, because we're not really gaming what the name of the entire system is, a participatory democracy. I think that is an ethical crime in of itself.
Well, I love Scott, but I also am going to disagree with him there. I got to tell you, I want to vote for something, not against something. So I have absolutely no problem. Voting for a third party candidate if I think both mainstream party candidates are bad. And let me give you a little framing here. So I have 3 children, I have 3 stepchildren, and my wife and I have told all of them that they can do anything in the world, but if they ever become politicians, we have failed as parents. So I'm not a big fan of politicians, period. And I think we have certainly in this country gone to a political class where, you know, I think that what the founders had started, what the Constitution talks about, is no longer, it doesn't even exist at this point. I think that if you took Thomas Paine's common sense and you replaced Crown with current Congress, Senate, President, it fits. Just do it. It's amazing. That said, and I actually, you know, the first time Trump ran, I wrote a letter, a public letter in Havoc Journal, where I basically said, I don't buy what you're selling. So as a veteran, tell me, like, I'm not voting against something. I want to vote for something. So tell me what I should be voting for, because all I hear from candidates is what I should not vote for. But I think that we have to start looking at either changing the system, okay, to go back to what it was, what it started out to be, instead of what it has become. Or I think you have an ethical responsibility if neither candidate speaks to you and you cannot support them for whatever the host of reasons is, whether that's who they are as a human being, which I completely back. If you don't want to vote for somebody because of the human being they are, if you want to vote for them because of their policies, totally back that. Then either vote for a third party candidate, or that is part of the participatory part of government, is saying, you know what, I'm not going to vote for the president because I think it's garbage. I think what's Brewster's Millions, none of the above, right? Or none of the above actually wins, because politicians are absolutely, like, they're going down the wrong path. But I think you have an ethical responsibility as a citizen to say, nope, you're not gonna force me to pick between 2 bad things. I don't think either one of these is okay. I'm out. I'll either vote for a third party, or I'm just gonna vote for local elections, because they're gonna impact me on a far greater scale. I don't know. So that's my thought.
We have the bookends, Sarah.
Just like last time. This is a real interesting question for me, particularly because I lived abroad for so long. And the first 8 years I was abroad, I didn't vote because I was like, well, I'm not there. It doesn't affect me. That's actually incorrect. It still affects me. And I remember having a conversation with some of my other expatriate friends who are from the UK, from France, from Australia, and they were more up to date on current affairs of politics in the United States than I was. And I would just kind of roll my eyes and be like, why do you guys even care? And I remember one of them looking at me and in a deadpan voice saying, because everything America does affects my country, and you should care too. And it was really that cold slap in the face that I needed, because I had abdicated the responsibility and went, not my problem, I'm not there. And yet it was part of me just ignoring it. That's how we've gotten here too. So many people have just ignored it, or we are victims to the algorithm on our phone. So we get shown more of the same thing, thinking therefore everything around us is like us. And so we have cognitive bias coming into play. And then people are not paying attention. They're getting, there's so much to take our attention. So I think it really requires, if you want to complain about something, my answer to this would be, if you're going to complain about something but do nothing, you're part of the problem. You need to do your own research. You need to stand by your values. And I agree with you, JC, that I would rather vote for something that I believe in. I'd rather move towards desire than avoid this. But if in order to get to my desire, I first have to play a game to avoid this so that the whole world doesn't burn, I'll do that too, because that might be the stepping stone to get to where we want to go, without making the problem worse than it is. So I think it really, maybe that answer is I'm going to vote for the third party. Maybe it's I start to rally and, call for more people to take action in a different way. Right. And so we each have our own methods, but one vote, one person. I mean, look at all the greats in history. It was one person whose voice wasn't the first time, like the I Have a Dream speech. That wasn't given one time and then changed the world. He actually gave that speech several times. But in that moment, with that right alchemy of who was there, who was listening, the tipping point of the energy of the people, it took and it stuck and it worked and we had change from it. So it's a cumulative effect as well. And I think people need to have their eye on the long game and not just right now.
You said so many things there, Sarah, that I just love. One, because I lived outside the country for 10 years myself. And like you, I didn't vote, not because I didn't think it mattered, but because I just wasn't paying attention. I was in seminary, I was involved in my studies, and there was no internet or easy access to news where I lived. And I just didn't concern myself with it. And therefore I didn't feel that it was really responsible of me to vote without having any idea what was going on. And that, I think, has a lot of relevance today, because as you said, either we're not paying attention or we're only paying attention to one side. And either way, if we're not informed, then we are not being responsible, whether we vote or we don't vote. But your last point was very insightful, I think, that we have to look at the long game. And I'll go back to my conviction that we could address a lot of our problems if we would break out of the binary thinking. We don't vote for third party. I've voted in my voting life more for third party candidates than I have for mainstream candidates. For the reason that you said, JC, I'm not going to let myself be forced voting for somebody that I think is unfit to serve. And if we could create a cultural mindset where we collectively don't feel bullied to choose between two awfuls, then we might open up our options. There are a lot of technical, practical ideas, but we're talking theory at the moment.
Well, I do have to say some things in response to some of this, some of which I agree. But one thing that I actually think is an illusion that people fall into, with all due respect to everything that's been said so far, we never really are voting just against someone or something, because when we're doing that, we're actually beneath it supporting that. So for instance, someone once said to me, my son got accused of being a racist because he voted for a candidate that had the support of the KKK. and who had said things that were racist. And that's not fair. He didn't support them. He's not a racist just because he supported a candidate that was racist. Actually, my point is no, he was. He viewed the racism as not big enough of an ethical issue to oppose. So he really was supporting it. He was supporting a prioritization of issues such that racism was an acceptable thing from an ethical perspective for him to put his vote behind. So when we say we want to vote only for things that are positive, or we don't want to vote against something, we're not really looking at the full framing or the full scale of the issues that are out there, nor are we often, and we as voters in the United States have been coddled that way, owning the implications of our voting. Those who say, and I hear this all the time, it's a pet peeve of mine, we're held hostage to a moneyed class or a political class or all this other stuff. Who are the people that put us in that position? It isn't the rich, it isn't the moneyed, it is us as a class of voters who have made choices again and again and again over a period of decades, so that we move away from what, JC, you're talking about, the original intent of the framers when they put together the system. Well, whose fault is that? We need to take ownership of it. All the people saying, I'm tired of voting against, or I'm just voting, blah, 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 all this other, I'm stuck, we don't have any choice, I give up, I throw my hands. And one thing that you're at least pointing to, Jonathan, is the idea that this is participatory. Then get yourself in there and get involved. Do what you need to do to create some sort of movement or build consensus with other people to get out of that mindset. But we as a collective body of voters view politicians, or we view the political class or the ruling elites as them. They're not. They're one of us. The monsters they are the monsters that we've created. We as voters don't own that. And that, to me, is the fundamental problem with the governmental system that we have in place right now.
We might have created it, but they're not us. And I'll give you two pieces of what you said. And I will say, like 60%, I probably agree with. I will say that this false binary choice of if you're not with it, you're against it. I disagree with that. I think I can agree with, you on 60% of what you said and not agree with other stuff. And that's okay. I think I can say I'm not supporting racism if I vote for a guy who at some point
is a racist,
supported by racists. I can say, look, I can support you and not believe everything that you believe. I think that's okay. I think, in fact, I remember a president once saying, if you're not with us, you're against us. And I remember thinking, well, that's kind of stupid too. But that's kind of what you're saying. If you're not for it, if you're not against it, you're for it. And that's not true. I don't see it. I think that false binary is a very dangerous place that gets people. And I'll tell you, if I say, hey, 90% of what this guy says, I agree with, but I don't like how he stands on this issue, but I'm going to support him. But that happens to be a hot button issue for you. I don't want to, maybe I don't think the same way he does. That doesn't mean that I'm for him. Now, no, hold on. I want to get to the other piece where you said they are us. They're not us. So when I first got out of the military, I was asked to run for office in a state that I was living. And I said, okay, I'll do this because I believe in the system. And I believe, I spent my entire adult life defending the system. And I went to one party and they said, well, you got to say all this stuff for us to give you our money. And I said, well, I believe in all that, but I don't believe in these three things. And they're like, well, you got to support all of it. This is the platform of our party. So if you want our money, this is what you say. And I said, well, I'm not doing that. So I went to the other party because I thought, well, maybe they'll be different. And I said, okay, I'd like to run for office. I think I got a shot. What do you think? And they said, great. We think you do too. You got to say all this stuff. And I said, well, I agree with this, but I don't agree with these things. And they said, nope. It's this platform to get our money. So that is the system. That's the system. You either buy in and take some of your values and your ethics. And oh, by the way, guess who's not running for office? Where I said, you know what? I don't. anybody who believes in either 100% of the platform of either party is a moron in my mind. And I say that unequivocally. They may be, Scott, the only absolute thing I'll say is if you believe everything that one party says, you're not thinking. But that said, I think that, you know, I really think that we have to be really thoughtful. I may not agree with anybody on here on a point, and I may find that point extremely, you know, despicable. It doesn't mean I don't value you as a person. It doesn't mean I wouldn't support you in something. I just wouldn't support you in that.
So let me just ask you this. During the pre-Civil War period, when people were voting on slavery, you would have been perfectly comfortable voting for a pro-slave person because they agreed with other things that you liked. And you would have said, no, just because slavery is continuing because of who I voted for doesn't mean that I'm a bad person just because I supported a pro-slavery candidate. That's your position.
That's a great point. So let's talk about, let's just say, do you know what percentage of the population actually voted pro-slavery?
Let's say this issue arose again tomorrow, because I don't think the ethical point should be distracted by the enumeration of the specifics of the time. That's poor rhetoric, and we can do better than that.
Oh, no. See, I think you're setting up a straw man, and we can do better than that. If you're going to say, because slavery is not an issue right now, so, and I'm not, at least not in this country. So if we're going to talk historical, I'll talk historical. If we're going to talk today, I'll talk today. But I do want to hear what Sarah thinks about this, though, because I don't want to take it over.
All right. So that's a very important point. But I think as well, Scott, if that was my voting point, if I said I'm not for this, I don't care if they have 9 things that I do like. If that is a non-negotiable for me, I won't vote for that person. So that's obviously a very hot topic. And there might be some people, like there's certain things that one of the candidates does that I do not support whatsoever. So I don't care if he gave me other policies on a silver platter and said, all of this will be fixed here. The rest of the shit that's happening, I can't get behind, because in order to get those things, we're going to dehumanize certain people or take certain action. So my answer would be no. So it is a slippery slope, just like many of the conversations we have in this room, in this forum, because your non-negotiable might be different than mine. So how do we get the collective to have the shared values, and how can we bring what has now spread out so far in this country? Because to me, to be quite honest, I view this as the states, not really the United States. And then we play a game every 4 years of pretending like we're friends, and we do all of this stuff with politics and have to get on this platform or that platform. And it's honestly a circus, in my opinion. You know, so what can we do instead? I think the rhetoric should really be around what can we do to change that, rather than, you know, point fingers and say, well, this is how it needs to be. It's absolute or it's not. How can we come to a common shared ground? Because your absolute might be different than somebody else's. Unless you're doing mathematics, there is no absolute truth.
I'd like to actually back up GSC on this in terms of the history. I mean, I think there's a tremendous amount to be learned from history. The first draft of the Declaration of Independence included an unequivocal statement that slavery was an offense against God. Thomas Jefferson put it in the first draft. It didn't make it into the second draft, the final draft, because only 11 of the 13 colonies voted for it. And they needed a unanimous vote. What if any one of those 11 countries had said, no, this is a core value, we cannot compromise on this? There would not have been a country. So that overriding value of creating a unified country meant that some people were going to have to go along with something that they felt was a crime against God. Now, how do you characterize that? Is that selling out? Or is that making a necessary concession for a higher value? And once you're willing to do that, then how do you determine when it's okay and when it's not okay? And that is purely a rhetorical question, because it's going to come down to every single choice where we have to weigh these seemingly impossible decisions between competing values.
It ties back into what JC was saying earlier. Again, something else I'll respectfully disagree with him about when he said the political class is not us. And you talked, that was a fascinating story. You wanted to run for office and you did not agree with all of these things that you said you had to agree with. I actually don't think that that demonstrates that the political class isn't us. It demonstrates to me that those who are advancing in the political class are people who make a specific set of ethical choices. You were, JC, willing to or insistent upon making a particular line draw in which you said, I'm not going to support these things. I'm not therefore willing to become part of the class. But for us as a political body that supports candidates, an understanding of realpolitik has to be necessary because we do live in the real world. Your example points to that, Jonas, and I do think that that's a fair statement. That being said, the pushback that I would have on that, leaving aside the Declaration of Independence itself, which is a unique sort of document historically and legally, when it comes to elected representatives making policy decisions, which is what we're talking about a lot of times, the real life consequences of those require some weighing. But are there ethical lines within which we as a culture, as a well-educated citizenry, are willing to say, we will not sink beneath? I use slavery as an example because if that were to come back as an issue, I would hope that we would say universally, no, that's something that we as a citizenry will not tolerate from anyone, rather than just simply saying, oh, it's a matter of ethical values. Saving $100 in taxes a month is far more important to me than another human being bonded. And if we as a political collective aren't willing to say that, then I would argue we don't have a cultural identity at all, and underscore exactly what Sarah said. We're just a bunch of people, not any sort of unified anything.
But the problem is, I can tell you that we support slavery in our everyday lives.
Yeah.
For those of us that are carrying around the iPhone, for those of us that are wearing certain Nike products, we do support slavery. We absolutely 100. If you drive an electric vehicle or have a rechargeable battery in your house, you are supporting slavery. So I do think that we have to be really, really thoughtful. And I love Sarah. I mean, I think that's your hot button issue, my hot button issue. And this is the problem that we all have, Scott. And this is where I want us to go. And this is why I love this group so much is I don't know who Sarah supports, and I don't know who you support, and I don't know who Jonathan supports. I don't know. And you don't know who I support. And yet I value you all. I think you all have incredible minds, great opinions. I like listening to them. Some stuff I agree with, some stuff makes me think, some stuff I go, yeah, I don't buy that. And that is where we need to go, as opposed to if we support this, we're bad. As opposed to, wait a second, I support this because of X, Y, and Z. Do you understand that? Oh, yeah, that doesn't make me bad. Just like it didn't make your friend's son a racist. He had reasons he was supporting certain things. That didn't mean he support racism. It means, and he's probably not a racist. What he did was he made decisions based on his life. And I respect that, just like you are making decisions based on your life. Sarah is making decisions based on her life. And I think that's really important that we accept those. And when we go into social contract, which is what we're talking about, and again, respectfully disagree, Scott, it's not a unique circumstance. What happened in the Constitution happens every day. We make concessions for certain things. We are not absolutists. I mean, those who are absolutists tend to be very, very unhappy people. So we make these concessions, but I think what we have to do is go, let's have a discussion. And for example, and I'll pick one, and I'm sorry, I'll just pick one topic. Okay. I guarantee you that we would agree on more things about gun control than we would disagree. Now, am I pro Second Amendment? 100% I am. However, Do I believe that there should be limitations? Of course I do. That said, when we have a platform that says you cannot support any limitations of the Second Amendment, or hey, the Second Amendment is completely wrong, those two opinions, I don't have to buy into either one of those. I can say somewhere in the middle is probably right. And to take that away from me takes away my freedom. That's my 2 cents. Or 4.
It's interesting you mentioned gun control, because a couple of years ago, I published an article, and I'm like you, JC, I basically support the Second Amendment, but I think there need to be common sense limitations. And I basically said that in the article. And I think it was minutes after I posted my weekly newsletter, I saw I'd had one subscription canceled. And I looked to see if it was about any new. And he was a friend of mine, and I knew exactly who he was and knew exactly why he'd been following me for years. And just, yep, this is his issue. I'm not going to read you anymore. I don't think we get too far with that kind of an attitude.
I don't.
I have to, again, respectfully disagree. If we don't have ethical boundaries with beyond which we will cross, then we do not stand for anything. And I do think, again, there are issues where the implications of them are fundamental, and that go as to the basic humanity. The extent of gun regulations is, to me, not something that goes as to whether human beings have fundamental humanity. I'm reminded of an interview I saw on a major television news magazine with an Iranian feminist who was sitting there in her headscarf and talking about the regime that she had supported, the Ayatollah Khomeini's regime. Oh, I didn't think at that time that, his positions on feminism and on women's rights were that big of a deal. What I wanted was just to get the U.S. out. Okay. And they said, well, so you voted for him? Yes. And then when he did exactly what he said he would do, and basically made your entire gender, including you, a second-class citizen. Yeah, she said, oops. Yeah, that kind of sucked. Yeah, it kind of sucked. When you support people, in my opinion, who deprive people of the fundamental right to participate in society as full human beings, you're crossing an ethical line. And sitting around saying, oh, some things, well, it depends. Well, again, where does it stop? Is someone immoral because, oh, I thought that, so-and-so was better than Pol Pot, so I joined his group, and oops, I guess I'm not a bad person because I supported someone that just slaughtered half of my population. Well, maybe we need to take a little harder of a line with each other and with ourselves. Now, not over every issue. I think that that's fair. But the idea that, oh, any idea is okay, and that doesn't make you a bad person. Well,
but I think
put
you're
yourself in the shoes of the
misrepresenting,
people that are
Scott.
suffering.
I think you're misrepresenting.
Yeah.
Yeah, I may not like the candidates running in this coming election. I don't compare either one of them to Pol Pot.
But where does it stop, Jonason?
Well,
where
does it stop? Is that's what ethics are all about. It's trying to find a place where I can compromise up to the point where I'm compromising my core values. And we conflated those ideas. We're so much of a culture now where any compromise to the party line, exactly your point, JC, right? You give them on one point, oh, you've sold out. I mean, look at how the Republicans love Joe Manchin. They love Joe Manchin, right? The one Democrat who's willing to buck the party line. But I don't know if she's still in office, the governor of Maine, Susan Collins, right, who was the most liberal member of the Republican Party. They despised her as a rhino, right? Republican in name only, right? She's not loyal to the party. I mean, you've got two people that are both pretty close to each other because they're both very much in the center, and a completely different point of view. If it's the other side, oh, this is a person of principle. If it's my side, this is a traitor. There's no rational thinking there. There's no willingness to accept that there's any legitimacy to any point of view other than my own. And that's why we have gridlock. yes, I agree with you. If you're passionate that something is an ethical issue and that's your core value, you don't want to compromise that. But just remember, there's somebody on the other side with a different principle that may also be legitimate, that's their core value, that they're unwilling to compromise. So, and they see it just as passionately as you see yours. And they see you're as unwilling to look at their point of view as you think they're unwilling to look at your point of view. Now, maybe objectively somebody's right. That's possible. Or maybe we're just so entrenched in our ideologies that we're not willing to give legitimacy to anything other than our own way of looking at the world.
I think, Scott, to your point about the basic humanity, if we could get consensus on what those things were, which slavery, the equal rights for all peoples, all races, all colors, all orientations, everything, if that was more set in stone and agreed upon, then that's very clear. But we make concessions. I'm sure even you as an absolutist make concessions every single day. You view honesty as a value, correct?
Mostly. I don't feel like that's one of those things that is necessarily black or white. I really don't. But I also don't view honesty as necessarily implicating anyone's fundamental humanity.
So what you're saying is on fundamental humanity issues, that's where you're black and white. But when it comes to something like honesty, there's a gray scale.
Yeah.
So you are not even absolutist in your absolutism.
I've never said I'm an absolutist. I say that I'm an absolutist about people's humanity.
Okay. So I think that's more clear, because to Jonathan's point, it's what JC is saying is, let's say you're a vegan and I eat meat. I don't have to stop liking you and supporting you and being your friend because you're doing something that I don't believe in or that I think is silly or whatever the thought process is, right? Like the unsubscriber because of that one issue. We all have our hot buttons. And again, each person has their different viewpoints. And so what I was going to say is, if you have honesty as a value, some people will be absolutist on that. I'm going to tell the truth no matter what, even if it's hurtful, even if it's not the right time or context, I'm just going to give it to you straight. And that will cause other issues. So it's similar to the toll conversation we had. What is the downstream effect of that? And so how do we then come up with these values of protecting humanity? I mean, it would seem that they would be common sense. I think everyone in this podcast would be in agreement on those values. So how can we as human beings tap into that and create a movement that becomes our discussion point, not some stupid conversation ping pong game of the Second Amendment, this or that, and that's it. That's all you get the option of. How do we then change the conversation to the this or that is fundamental basic human rights? And then beyond that, we have the ethics conversation.
And we don't agree on fundamental basic human rights. I guarantee you that even in this group, what somebody thinks is a fundamental basic human right, I may say, I don't think that's a human right. I think that's a privilege, or that's guaranteed by something else. And I think that, and I feel, and we've all been around the world. We've seen that there are people who are good people who think very differently than we do. And that they're not bad people and they're not bad humans, but they look at the world very differently and they live that way. And I really hate to judge them by my standards, thinking that my standards of humanity are the right ones.
And that, I think, is an ongoing tension. We want to be committed to our own core values, and we want to acknowledge that other people may have a different, legitimate way of looking at the world. And those two ideas do not get along very well. I really, this conversation has been, I think, extremely valuable and insightful. It's very much on my mind because I'm reading Founding Brothers. Only took me 20 years to get around to reading it. Everybody should read this book. It is a marvelous representation of how this country got started by focusing in on a few isolated incidents and showing how the macro can be learned from the micro. But his basic premise is that this country was founded on contradictions, on paradox. You had freedom of the individual in a society that had slaves. You had the need for a federal government in a society that was founded on individual rights, state rights. And there was a constant grappling between these competing values. And his premise is we make a mistake by trying to eliminate that tension. What we should be doing is engaging in civil discourse, constructive disagreement. I've said this constantly, and I will continue to, that liberals and conservatives need each other. Because if we don't talk to each other, then conservatism devolves into reactionaryism, and liberalism spirals into irrational utopianism. And by talking to each other, that's what keeps us honest. That's what keeps us balanced. That's what preserves a rational middle, not just because it's somewhere in the middle, but because it balances the extremes and it creates a core that keeps the ship on course. And if more of these conversations can contribute to that, then I hope I'll have the opportunity to continue. So thank you all. I hate to cut it off because I know just feel like we're getting up ahead of steam, but thank you very much, JC Click, Sarah Calmetta, and Scott Mason. Look forward to when we can do it again. To those of you who are listening or watching, if you have a topic you'd like to stake up, please go to my website, ethicsninja.com. Use the contact information to submit your idea. If it's compelling, we'll take it up in a future episode. And until then, please continue to grapple with the gray.